Hello, viewers, and welcome to Spotlight here on Hope TV, where you look and live. And here on Spotlight, we always do our very best to bring to you persons who are changing our community, especially in the direction of light. And we are joined on this program by one person who has been a banker on one side, been an accountant on the other, and left all this and decided that she'd want to move to the world of young people, specifically impact in them the beauty of leadership. Now that's quite something, moving from the financial sector and then deciding to just get into the sea of young people with one spirit of just making them leaders for their generation. That's fantastic. And we are happy to be joined in Spotlight today by the CEO of LAPID Africa, and that is Esther Moneki. Welcome to Spotlight.
Thank you for having me.
Bold move.
Thank you.
Leaving all the money, let me say, and then joining the sea of young people. And viewers, always remember you're part of this conversation, so text us on 22232. That's our text message line. Also engage us on Twitter and Facebook. We'll be glad to hear what you have to say. And again, welcome.
Thank you.
Young people.
Yes.
It's you'd have been way better off working out a career and just climbing,
way wealthier.
climbing all the way to the top. But you took a departure, right? Just tell us a little bit about your passion for young people. How did that come, or what energizes that?
I think I was set up by God. I honestly believe that I was just set up by God. When I finished campus in 04, I was in Kenyatta University doing BCom. Was ready for the accounting world, got a good job with PricewaterhouseCoopers and started from the lowest, and was actually growing very fast. I stayed with them for about 6 years. In 2009, I was a manager. I was sent on secondment to UK. I was okay with my life. And landed in UK. I didn't like the weather immediately, and I knew I wouldn't be there for too long. But also I think that awoke something in me towards the passion for the continent. I just realized we have a beautiful continent. We have fantastic weather.
You had to leave it for you to
imagine
realize
you do. I realized we have fantastic weather. I mean, I remember the first day I landed in the office, it was dark and it was winter, and so the sun came out at around 10, 11 and was back out at 3 o'clock. So I'd report to work, it's dark, I'd go home, it's dark. And I'd think, who lives in such a country? And so I'd miss my home, but also even in terms of our culture as people, we are really warm. And the West is very different. And so every 3 months I'd come back home. But I would also come back home and think, I can't even drive on a road without... There's no lane that's set for me to, it's a jungle. Okay.
So all of a sudden, right, you also realize that Kenyan roads have no lanes.
Yes.
Right? And
it's survival.
It's amazing. We are able actually to keep a lane, We are magical.
We honestly are magical that we don't go hitting each other on the roads. And so that...
It's mostly because we don't work on lanes, we work on space. Where is the space?
True. As long as your car can fix itself somewhere.
Lanes when there is space?
True.
Anyway.
And so that started a conversation in my spirit around what's the difference between this developed world and what is called underdeveloped Africa. We are warm, we have every good things. I always tell people this continent is rich. When you think about Congo and the minerals that are in Congo, when you think about South Africa, when the word gold rush came about, it was because people went to South Africa and found this gold, and they all rushed to South Africa. When you think about the wildlife, there's nowhere else in the world where in the city you will go and meet with a lion. We are blessed as a continent. The weather here is a gift. And yet. And so for me, that's the conversation that started in my spirit. What is the yet?
Okay.
And so I was there for I was supposed to be there for 2 years exactly, but in my 20th month, I got baptized that side. I knew I was called for this continent. And so I came back. And in my heart, I knew that I wanted to do more for the continent.
And and that's interesting, because most of the young people who go, especially at that particular place where you left for the UK, you'd rather make a life there, right?
Agree.
But now you had this great trek back, to the continent, which is already in itself counter, what it is that most people would do.
Yeah. In fact, I remember calling the partner who was the HR partner in PwC and telling him it was the 19th month. I'm coming back. The question is not if. The question is whether you guys are having me. And for me, he told me that makes sense. I mean, you're in London, you're in Leeds. People actually ask to be extended. Why are you coming back? But in my heart, I knew I'd gone there to see. And I had seen. And I knew my time was done, and I was gonna come back. Some of my friends, in fact, some of the people who we went with are still there even today.
And it's interesting that you would talk about a burden, for the continent. Sometimes you would think the continent as a really big thing. It's good enough if you had a burden for your village, but now here you are with a burden for the continent, and I think that's quite something, right? Just tell us more about the calling to the young people, how that just zeroed in as what you really needed to do.
That's a good question. So when I came back, I was clear I was gonna do everything that I can for this continent to stop being called underdeveloped. Not in my time, and I guess that's how God created me. I get angry I want to do something about it. And so I came back. Somewhere along the way, I left PwC and I joined Guarantee Trust Bank. But actually, when I left PwC, I had clarity I wanted to work with leadership. I knew the gap was in leadership. And so, in fact, I wanted to go and join a leadership program. But I got a lot of pushback of, Esther, you can't leave this large organization to go and start. I wanted to go and start as an intern in a place and figure out what does this leadership.
But that's how a calling looks like. A calling kind of pushes you to do some outrageous things. You are this manager and you want to be an intern. That's what a calling. If you want to know that you're called, those are some of the signs. You do some outrageous kind of things.
I knew in my heart that that's what I wanted to do.
Okay, so the gap is in leadership.
I knew the gap was
in
leadership.
Then you joined a new corporation.
I did. So I joined GT Bank. And when I was leaving PwC, I didn't want to go. In fact, I was going to go to the internship, but the pushback made me think maybe I'm mad. Let me go and get employed. And so, fortunately, I got a good job, a really good job as the head of risk and compliance for GT Bank, and joined them. But there, I think, is where it all came together, because for me, I started to see we had a lot of young people, but their work wasn't good quality. And as senior managers, we constantly talked about how they're half-baked students, that the universities are releasing students that are half-baked, not ready for the workplace.
Okay, just when you're at it, Esther, do you feel sometimes it's almost a paradox that these are young people, millennials, and then on the other hand, work is not the way it's supposed to be. You'd expect that these are young people, sharp, brilliant, and therefore work is not, you're not talking about basic work, you're talking about new things, new ways of doing work. But when you hear something like young people, work is not being done the way it's supposed, kind of a paradoxical when you think about it. Anyway, just go on.
No, it actually is. It's because our universities focus a lot on technical skills. But the world has never been driven by technical skills. Technical skills are important, but there's only so far you can go with technical skills, and especially in the 21st century, because the world moves very fast. I mean, the other day I was watching Larry Madowo talking to Sophia, a robot, and they're having an intelligent conversation. That's not what you will learn. You will learn how to do coding in school, but what moves the world today is actually soft skills, and that's what universities don't spend enough time with. And so in GTB, I saw that gap, and half of the time we're complaining about it. But somewhere along the way, the HR manager and myself formed a mentorship program that did a huge difference in a very short time, and we were now listening, because I think it's possible for us to keep constantly talking about young people and throwing stones, but we never take the time to listen. What is the issue? What's the gap? What are they struggling with? And in the process, because I'd seen it work in PwC, they were very intentional in training, coaching, mentorship. And you could see the impact of that within a short period. And so we started to do the same thing within GTB. I had a team, and I remember some of the guys I worked with, I would release them, and I guess I don't struggle with releasing things. And so I was growing them really fast. And I'd see how they were becoming very good, which means they have the skill. They just need somebody to believe in them and mentor them and coach them.
All right. Yeah.
And so by 2014, I had clarity that this is something that works. And I had clarity that I wanted to work with leadership. But now I knew who I wanted to work with.
Young people.
Young people.
All right. And that's where LAPID comes in.
Yes.
And just before we talk about LAPID, statistics usually
Yeah.
the youth statistic is thrown at us all the time. You know, 60% of the continent's population are young people, right? It's even pushed further in Kenya, like 75%, you know, of the people in Kenya are young people. So you either go young or go home. You know, that's the kind of statistic we get. But let me ask you, you know, this statistic, young people, 75%, huge, right? But is it working for our communities, or is it working against the communities? I mean, is it like a positive statistic, or is it something that they call a time bomb, you know?
I think it's a bit of both. It depends with how you look at it. First of all, and this will debunk things, this is not the first time we've had the youngest population in Africa. I mean, in the 60s, we had a youthful population in this continent, and we are still in a mess. And so having a youthful population, it's called a demographic dividend, is a good thing. If and only if you convert it into a useful thing. I mean, it's possible to have 60% of our population that's honestly useless. You're better off with an older population. I look at the statistics every day and it breaks my heart. I mean, 40% of our young people are unemployed. The statistics of unemployment are slightly lower because when jobs are released, the people who get jobs are actually older people. The joke that we make of young people are not given jobs because they're not good enough is actually real if you look at the statistics. There is some study that World Bank did the other day, and they were saying a good chunk of the jobs in this country are to security firms. Now, let me break that down. Security firms means that we are taking people to universities to come and guard people's capital. There's a problem with that. That same study said that the maximum education that these people need is up until standard 3 for the kind of jobs that people are getting. It's underemployment. So in addition to being high levels of unemployment, we also have high levels of underemployment. Underemployment means I'm doing a job that a standard 3 person can do. In other words, it's a waste.
So the population, it can, as you say, pays depending on what you do with it.
It does.
Now, you know what, Esther, it's like very few people know what to do with young people. It's like everyone is guessing. The government is guessing, you know, let's put this fund. But the fund is not pushing, it's not bringing the revolution, you know. If the launch of the fund was anything to go by, then you'd know we have a revolution in this country coming. But, you know, many years down the line, no revolution, right? If politicians and the kind of promises they make and the kind of addresses they make to young people are anything to go by, you'd think that, oh, you know, now young people are going to be the center of life. But you wait for the young people's revolution, you never find it, you know, and it seems like we do not know what to do with them. Now, LAPID, what are the solutions that LAPID is offering for young people?
First, let me say, a society's failure is when it can't deal with its youth. Your parents' responsibility was to make sure you're standing. Society's responsibility is to make sure the next generation is moving forward. And so when the next generation is failing, society has failed. And so if we have a demographic loss, we as a society must take responsibility for it. Our governments are ours. And so we must take responsibility for the time bomb that's the youth, that we didn't plan for them, that we didn't think about what we want them to do. I give the example of Christ. Christ says, my disciples will be greater than I am. That's a responsibility of every leader. And so as a society, if this generation that's coming after us is not greater than we are, we failed. And we must take responsibility. We must stop pointing fingers to millennials and first say, I failed the millennials. And I think that's an important thing. So what do we do within LAPID? I think before I even go to LAPID, let me also say it's a government's responsibility to think about millennials. This country will only go as far as young people are going. And if we are not investing, I mean, I was reading about the amount of investment that's been done in China to the youth in primary schools because they're preparing them to take over the world. Are we doing that kind of investment? There's a lot of trial and error that we are doing. So what we do within LAPID is we recognize that there are 3 things that are important to the next generation. And the 3 things are important because they will drive them beyond themselves. It's a good thing that we take them through university, but it's not enough. and so we focus on three things. One is building self-awareness, and so we call it leading self. And the focus of that pillar is around helping the young person to understand themselves better. A couple of weeks ago, I was in KU. We'd been invited by Equity Leaders program. And the first question I asked is, what do you think are some of the challenges young people face? And the first answer I got broke my heart: hopelessness. And then that became now gambling. And it became, we blame them for gambling, but we must take responsibility for it. And so the leading self pillar is about self-awareness. In this mess, God is still there. And God created a human being with a purpose in mind.
When you're still on this first pillar of leading self, let's talk perception. The perception usually, and the perception young people create to the immediate environment is that, I know, right? I know. Don't tell me whom I should be, right? Only to find that they really didn't know. Or what they knew was self-destruction, So it's quite interesting when you think about, when you hear a pillar like self, self-awareness and, just trying to get to a place where you can lead self. So yeah, big solution.
It is. And the best example to think about is a child. If a child comes to you and tells you, I can run at 2 years or at 2 months, it is the adult's responsibility to know better. So it's the adult's responsibility to listen, but no, you cannot run. And that's why I always throw it back to society, because it doesn't matter what the youth tell us, we should know better. And there is a conversation around fake it till you make it. But if you ask me, that's a cry for help. And we should be able to listen to that as we would a child. When a child tells me I can run at 2 months, I know in my head, that's a cry for help. I don't listen to the child telling me I can run and let them run. And
of course, just before you go to the second pillar, it is how you get the millennial, to get to a place where they can actually appreciate that they need to learn, right? That journey. Because again, one of the things that they don't want to be perceived as is children, They want to be perceived as whole units by themselves. True. So the journey of leading them to that place where they can hold a conversation, is quite something.
Actually, that's probably one of our greater challenges, to get them to recognize that, and there's nothing wrong with I don't know. I tell people in their 60s don't even know about themselves. And so this is an opportunity for you to run ahead of that. For me, if you're in your early 20s, the best thing you can do is tell yourself, I don't know, and reconcile with that. There's a book I tell people to read called Defining Decade that talks about the 20s as a defining decade. But it only becomes a defining decade if you're okay with the conversation of I don't know. So you're right. That transition from I'm supposed to know everything to I don't know. And for us, when we get that point, and it's the reason Paul tells in the Bible, I pray, but I don't know how to pray. That power of I don't know is when the Spirit intercedes for a human being.
That's amazing. You've just called it the power of I do not know. That's a new line of thinking right there, Esther. Second pillar.
Second pillar is lead marketplace. So the first one is self-awareness, and we do a lot of coaching to help the students to figure out what they are. Lead marketplace is about skills. And so we focus on 2 skills, employability and entrepreneurship. Employability is asking the question of, so you have the technical skills, how do you package it for the workplace? CVs writing is packaging. Interviews is about packaging. How do you communicate with your interviewer? So we have a pool of HR people who will come on board. They will interview them, give them one-on-one feedback. We have classes around how do you write your CV so that it's exceptional. We have classes around how do you communicate in the workplace, because even if you're going to build a business, if you can't communicate it, it won't work. So a lot of employability skills, we call them employability skills, but also entrepreneurship skills. We believe every young person must have an entrepreneurial mindset. Are
you saying they are hustlers? There has to be a hustling.
I don't like the word hustling.
Like sell chicken for 10 years, and then rise all the way up to the political ranks, and that identity of hustling remains with you, okay?
For me, when I think about entrepreneurship, I think building for generations. Honestly, the best example I have for an entrepreneur, and I know this sounds strange, is Moses and Nehemiah. It's people who God gives them a vision to save the Israelites and takes the journey of 40 years to get them to the Israelites that they are today. Nehemiah sees a problem of a wall that's broken and going and fixing that. And so we approach entrepreneurship from a perspective of problem solving. Mm-hmm. A couple of weeks ago, we were having a conversation with a lady who, she saw a problem of, I can give you all the details, but she saw a problem of changing diapers. There are no spaces where people change diapers in Nairobi. And so she built a social enterprise that does that. That's entrepreneurship.
Okay.
It's one problem-oriented.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big thing. What is a problem I've seen that I can fix? It's not those things of hot air, of hustling. So number one is problem. Number two is process. Mm-hmm. We talk about, and this is a big gap within millennials. They're microwave generations, what they're called. They want to get the business up and running in 2 seconds. And I always use the Bible. A thing built on sand must come down. If it has structures, foundation, it will stand. Mm-hmm. And that's the power of process. Mm-hmm. So entrepreneurship is problem-oriented, and that's process-oriented,
okay.
And then skills.
All right.
Yeah.
Quite a rich philosophy there.
Yeah.
That's the second pillar, right?
Yes.
Now, when you are at that,
yes.
Talking about employability and talking about entrepreneurship,
yes,
money,
yeah.
right? And the push for the young person today to be rich and young, like millionaires under 20, billionaires under 30,
yeah.
Never billionaires above 50. It's always under. It has to be under.
Yeah.
Now, this push for money as a big identity, right? And its connection to corruption, right? Can you speak to that?
Oh. I take water so that I manage myself.
That's okay.
So this past weekend we had a conversation. We were hosting several young people in a conversation around opportunities in financial services sector. Mm-hmm. The conversation quickly converted to how every young person has 5 loans in Tala, in M-Shwari, in whatever. And what still it's loans for lifestyle. My hair, my phone, those things. And so we have built a financial literacy generation that's very low. But honestly, again, I don't blame them. It's the conversation that of young rich that builds pressure for people not to build with process in mind, but with richness in mind. And as older generations, we've failed because in this country, we have less stories of people who've built and more stories. And I blame, unfortunately, media. I mean, the stories that we feature on media are around people who we can't tell how they got their wealth. In this country, if you want to become a politician, have a huge scandal, and the following day, people will elect you. So what are we speaking in terms of the values that we are demonstrating? And I always tell people, young people don't learn from what they hear or what we tell them. They learn from what they see. So if they say that the only way for people to build wealth in this country is through hot air, selling hot air and corrupt deals, that's what they will do. And by the way, they will be worse. And
that's how you get your applause, I mean, you just cut deals that are unimaginable,
yes,
right? Including selling things that don't exist.
Yes, and they will do it even better than previous generations have done. If people made money from hot air, they will create hot air. I mean, that's the one thing that young people are. They take every small thing, they multiply it. And so I think it's a societal failure that we don't demonstrate the value of process. And media must take responsibility because media is a gatekeeper of society.
Just again to put this in context, that young people are growing at a time when the line that we hear a lot from a lot of people is that you cannot legislate morality. So don't moralize it, don't moralize this thing. So it's like the issue of values and, putting them as part of their, hardware. It's like, I mean, who are you, to tell me how to do things,
That's
right?
true, but it's such a failure. And it's it goes back to the African identity. So let me give you an example. Currently in Harvard, they are currently doing studies around how do they build back character education into their education. So there are a lot of things that are happening from a political perspective that may make them think, wait, how did we get here? And so leading professors are actually trying to figure out how do we build back morals, character into our education. And I remember listening to a conversation that was around how they're doing those studies and thinking, this is where we feel as Africans. We have always had character and morals within our education. And when we talk about education, it's people think education is just school. Education, even during pre-colonial, was happening. Those fireplace conversations that people used to have, we ran a podcast called Fireplace Conversations, and it's because those fireplace conversations were education. I make fun, and I think when I was growing up, if I did something that wasn't right, it was my mother who will deal with it. And when my aunt lands at home, she will also deal with it. Because she was not raising a child for society, for my mom, but for society.
Yeah.
And so naturally, in the African setting, character, moral education has always been a big part of who we are.
Okay, and we need to save it. Because,
we do, but
because
the reason we're not saving
anyone who speaks
yes.
morality,
yes.
I mean, social media will be up in arms against you, you know?
No, but
that's
it's
just
an
the way it
identity
is.
problem. It's because we have borrowed, copied. The other day, Trevor was making fun that so a big thing in Silicon Valley at the moment is walking barefoot. Africa has always done barefoot walking, and they've just discovered right now there's benefit of walking barefoot. What I'm saying is, what Africans actually need to do is be comfortable with their African identity. And one of that African identity is character, and moral education is a big part of who we are.
All right. The third pillar.
The third pillar is Lead Africa, which ties with what I've talked about. The big picture of the Lead Africa is building up an African mindset that's anchored on African values. And maybe, let me say on values, not African values. Pan-African mindset that's anchored on values. And we do a lot of things. One, we do African history labs that take us to the history, that take us to those fireplaces. I mean, I tell people, the first university in the world was in Timbuktu in Africa. And yet, we've always set the pace for the world. When you think about the Egyptian, it said actually the civilization started in Africa. But we think of ourselves as less than the rest of the world. And that's why we copy. It's why we're copying the lack of morals. It's why we're copying the lack of churches. We copy because we think our society is inferior.
You know, when you're at it
Yeah.
and talking about African labs,
Yeah.
right? And having a Pan-African mindset.
Yeah.
I want you to just maybe tell us how challenging that is.
Yeah.
Especially when you have young people who are growing with their, not just their eyes, but their hearts on the West. You know, how successful are you?
Actually, we are very successful. What I love about millennials is at the heart of who they are very substance driven. So there's a lot of conversations around millennials, how they've left church. But the reason they've left church is because they're substance driven. Millennials are they're very authentic by nature. And so they actually connect a lot with the African identity story. I think for me, in fact, the thing I'm most proud of is I finish a class and have conversations with them and I can tell, you got it. And that, I think, is such a big thing for us. And we bring a lot of people on board who challenge their thinking around that. But imagine that's not even our biggest challenge. That actually they get very fast. Because the history labs are highly practical, but they're also very authentic. They have the good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, it would be a lie to say that the African society didn't have things that were not right. But the bigger picture is there's a lot of brokenness in our world that is easy to see if you look at it from an African perspective. So actually we don't struggle with that. And so that's why we do the Africa History Labs. We do what we call an Africa Experience, which is a study trip to a country within the region. And so they go to Ethiopia, they meet with government leaders. So they go to African Union, they go to businesses that are building Pan-African businesses. There's a company I like that's called Ethio Chicken. They've done Ethiopia, we've done Rwanda, we've done, in Ethiopia even do an agricultural transformation kind of agency. They've done Zambia, they've had meetings with the COMESA Secretary General. They've done Rwanda.
You know, allow me to just check in.
Yeah.
Because all these cooperations and partnerships with, I'm sure, institutions that are around the continent, right? And because you come from a place of faith, do you find it helpful, or do you have any partnerships with the church?
So, one, I don't have formal partnerships with churches, but we do work with churches. But even with this Africa experience, I remember when I started, and I'll be very honest, I really wanted to work with churches, but it wasn't going to work. My faith in, and I think that was part of what God wanted me to learn, was I will build my church. Not the church builds it, God builds the church. And I remember the first time when I got the idea to do a study trip, it was ridiculous. We wanted to send them to Rwanda. We had no finances, nobody in Rwanda we knew, but God had given instructions to sending these kids across the continent. And I remember I tried working with the church, I was frustrated, and eventually, and I kept hearing God saying, I will build my church, And I tell you, the way even we raised the finances to go to Rwanda, nobody can take the credit except God. And each one of those trips, God makes the way. I remember the first time we did Ethiopia, we prayed a lot about it. And when we were praying, the one thing God kept saying was, I'm opening a trade line between Kenya and Ethiopia. A trade route, a traditional trade route, the way we used to have trade routes. Recently I saw the president had gone to Ethiopia and in a trade route, opened a trade route between Ethiopia and Kenya, and I knew this is what God has been doing from the word go. And so for us, honestly, it has been built by God. No one else can take credit. We've gone to spaces. I remember when we were planning in Zambia, we tried to get access to the COMESA Secretary General. It was hard, but they landed and he said, I must meet with these young kids. I've never met the Secretary General for COMESA, but they met with him and had a fantastic session with him. And in all honesty, God has built everything that we have done. I challenge the church a lot. I think the church has got into a space where it builds itself. And there are a lot of systems and structures which are good, but we become slaves of systems and structures. And so God has become secondary to systems and structures. And churches should have systems and structures. But the first system and structure a church must have is God. And when you have God as your first system and structure, but then he will throw you off. And so every time you're in a church and God never throws you off, ask, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
And I think for me, I have a lot of conversations I'd like to raise within the church. You need to ask yourselves, why are millennials exiting in numbers from the church? And the church is the bride of Christ. The hope of the world is the church. I build what I do because I belong to a church that from day one sang the song of Esther. God has called you to do great things.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are pastors who are watching this program, and that question, I'm sure they must find a way of answering it. Now, it's interesting just how quickly time runs, but I have to ask you the question of preparing young people, for entrepreneurship, for employment, giving them this Pan-African experience. Coming back home, and especially given that you are talking about African values, is LAPID doing something about young people and family life?
No,
okay.
Not directly. So we are very focused on leadership from a continental perspective. And every time you're building anything, you must be clear on what you want to do. You can't do everything. And so for us, that was what we wanted to focus on. That said, what has happened over time is we have about 350 students who've gone through the program now. And so I think early last year, they said they wanted to go through a journey around relationships and family. And so what they did is we have a huge pool of really passionate mentors. And so they got one of the mentors to do a journey with them for a whole year. And so one of our mentors was journeying with ladies, and her husband was journeying with a man. Okay. And so what has happened within LAPID is we have a clarity over what we are called to do, which is raise leaders for the continent. Relationships are a big part of that, but we don't do it directly. We have such a rich network. And so a mentor last year she was running with them for the whole year, and they did such a fantastic job around building perspectives on how they will build their families. We have other people. I have another mentor who somewhere along the way realized that she wants to do more intentional conversations with financial literacy. And so some people have also been going through her program. Okay. And so what has happened is we are what we are, but we are also a landing form. Okay. From there, a lot of things
will come. Yeah. And given that LAPID is on a journey, then I'm sure that as it builds up, as young people bring that as a need, I'm sure you'll have as an articulate way to handle that as the other pillars that you mentioned. Finally, right? A research was done some years back by Aga Khan University.
Yeah.
And it showed that young people are willing to steal, you know, for them to be rich. They don't mind actually, you know, those kind of under the table kind of deals, as long as they get rich. You know, that goes to the question of integrity. Can you just speak to young people and how they can be able to generate a sense of, I think the word used was authentic, how they can get an authentic sense of integrity in their dealings, whether you are in a college exam room or whether you are in a workstation, whether you are negotiating a business deal, how do you generate authentic integrity?
So I'll use an example, and there's one of the leaders that I really look up to is Strive Masiyiwa. He's the CEO and founder of Econet, and he's a great global leader. A couple of years ago, early 2000s, he was in Nigeria and he was starting Econet there, and there was a lot of, and this is documented, and there was a lot of pressure for him to bribe the governors and the people there for them to set up Econet. And he told them, I will never do that. And he runs a Facebook page where he talks about integrity a lot and how it's taken him a long time to build what he's built, but it's built on integrity. And he gave an example that for me, and I think he gave it in passing, but for me, I could tell the prophetic word he was using. He said a bishop came to him and told him in those early 2000s and maybe actually 90s, I think, it was way back. And someone was telling him, came and told him, Strive, you will open the doors for this continent. And right now, it looks like you've been fungiwadi in Nigeria, but you will set the pace for this continent. A couple of years ago, when we were doing the Global Entrepreneurship Summit, the person who opened the doors for people in Kenya was Strive Masiyiwa. He's a global leader now, a global great leader who runs billion-dollar businesses. Why am I using that example? For every young person, listen to this, and it's God is raising a new generation. And I'm convinced young people will change this continent, but only men and women of integrity. Does that mean it's easy? No. But only men of integrity will change this continent.
That's a wonderful line there, that yes, a lot is happening in this continent, but the people who will actually do it, the young people who will count, are the young people of integrity. Esther? Thank you very much for being here on Spotlight.
Thank you for having me.
We pray you all the best as you continue with this bold initiative, and may you bear much fruit.
Thank you.
That will last.
Amen.
Viewers, this is Spotlight, and we are taking a short break. We've just been talking to Esther Moneki, who is the founder and CEO of LAPID Africa. And once we come back, we'll be talking to two young people who are beneficiaries of the LAPID Africa Leaders Program, and that is Sydney Bukulu, and also we'll be talking to Rispa Wanja, and you want to hear their perspectives. So stay with us. Again, this is Spotlight. Keep engaging us on 22232. That's our text message line. Also on Facebook and Twitter. You are always welcome to be part of this conversation. We'll be right back.